All right, today we're diving into the Progressive Era. Now, this was a really pivotal moment in American history, a time when the country kind of had to face the dark side of its own success. People started looking past that shiny, glittering surface of a new industrial age, and they saw some serious problems underneath. And the key thing here? They decided to roll up their sleeves and actually fix them. So let's get into how they pulled it off.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the problems of what's called the Gilded Age. Then we'll see how journalists blew the lid off of everything. After that, we'll hit the three big areas of reform: taming those industrial giants, cleaning up the cities, and putting power back in the hands of the people. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at what it all means for us today.
Okay, first up, America's gilded problems. Let's really set the scene here. We're talking about the late 1800s, a time that Mark Twain famously nicknamed the Gilded Age. And that name is just perfect, because gilded means something is covered in a thin layer of gold, but it's not solid gold. It really tells you everything you need to know.
And this slide really gets to the heart of that paradox. On one hand, you've got all of this amazing promise, right? We're talking massive industrial growth, incredible new technology, cities just exploding in size. It looked golden. But then you peel back that thin layer of gold, and what's underneath? Well, it's a pretty grim reality for millions of people. Widespread poverty, absolutely dangerous working conditions, and just rampant corruption in politics.
You can really boil all of those issues down to three core crises. First, you had this unchecked industrial capitalism, basically a total free-for-all with almost no rules. Second, cities were growing way too fast. They were unsanitary, unsafe, just not ready for the flood of people coming in. And third, political corruption was everywhere, at every single level of government. So yeah, that was the mess the progressives had to deal with.
So with all that mess, where do you even start? How does real change actually happen? Well, it usually starts when someone is brave enough to shine a light in the darkest corners. And the people holding the lanterns this time around? They were a new kind of investigative journalist, and they got a pretty interesting name: the muckrakers.
Believe it or not, the name muckraker was originally an insult. But these reporters, they just owned it. They saw it as their job to rake through all the muck of society, the greed, the injustice, and expose it in magazines and newspapers for the whole country to see. And their work was so important. I mean, think about Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. It exposed the disgusting, horrifying conditions in the meatpacking industry so powerfully that it directly led to new food safety laws. They weren't just reporting stories, they were creating public outrage, and that outrage was the fuel for reform.
And these journalists, they looked everywhere. Seriously, nothing was off limits. They went after corrupt corporations and trusts. They exposed the brutal social injustices that working people and the poor were facing every single day. They uncovered political dishonesty from the local city hall all the way up to the U.S. Senate. And they wrote these absolutely gut-wrenching stories about what life was really like in the city slums. They put it all out there for everyone to see.
Okay, so the public is angry, they're fired up, and they're demanding action. It's time to get to work. And the first major battleground for the progressives was a big one, trying to rein in the incredible power of corporate America.
And this was the huge question they were facing, right? How do you even begin to regulate these massive industrial giants who, for all intents and purposes, seem to be above the law? How do you make sure that the chase for profits doesn't end up destroying people's lives and the country's natural resources?
Well, they came at it with a kind of three-pronged attack, all through legislation. Step one, busting the trusts. They used new antitrust laws to break up these giant monopolies that were crushing all competition. Step two, protecting consumers. This is where you get landmark laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act, making sure the stuff people were buying was actually safe. And step three, regulating key industries like the railroads to stop them from charging unfair prices. The big takeaway here is that for the first time, the government was really stepping in to act as a referee.
But this fight against corporate power wasn't just happening in factories or in courtrooms. It was also happening out in America's wild spaces. You see, the progressives looked around and saw that unchecked industry was literally devouring the country's natural landscapes. So this led to a whole new conservation movement, which gave us things like the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service. It was all about preserving these natural treasures before it was too late.
All right, so they're taking on the industrial giants. But at the same time, the progressives also had to turn their attention to the chaotic, sprawling cities that these industries had created. This explosive growth led to a whole new set of really horrifying problems that needed to be solved, and fast.
I mean, just try to picture it. You have millions of people, a lot of them brand new immigrants, all crammed into these neighborhoods with no sanitation, incredibly unsafe housing, and pretty much zero social services. The challenge was just immense. How on earth do you turn these dangerous, chaotic places into communities where people can actually live?
The solutions were really practical, very hands-on. Reformers started what were called settlement houses. Think of them like community centers that helped immigrants get on their feet. Cities started investing in huge public sanitation projects to clean up the streets and get clean water to people. And they passed new building codes to stop the worst of the tenement housing, requiring basic things we take for granted, like light and fresh air.
Okay, so they've taken on industry and they've started cleaning up the cities. But the progressives were smart. They knew that none of these fixes would stick if the political and financial systems themselves were still broken. It was time to reform the whole system from the inside out. And a huge piece of that was fixing the financial system. See, the economy back then was super unstable. It was prone to these wild booms and devastating panics. So in 1913, they passed the Federal Reserve Act. This created a central banking system to help control the money supply and keep an eye on the banks. The goal was really simple, but it was also revolutionary. Bring some stability to the whole American economy.
But really, the biggest goal of all was political. They knew that so much of the corruption came from a system where the average person had almost no power. The ultimate dream of the progressives was to snatch that power away from corrupt political bosses and giant corporations and give it back to the people. And to do this, they were going to have to rewrite the rule book. We're talking about passing 4 huge, groundbreaking amendments to the Constitution.
First up, you have the 16th Amendment. This created the federal income tax. Now, before this, the government made most of its money from tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. And that system really hurt poor and working-class people the most. The income tax was a radical new idea, a fair system where the government could raise money from those who had the most, which in turn could help pay for all these new reforms.
Next is the 17th Amendment. And this one was a total game changer for democracy. Before this, U.S. senators weren't elected by the people. They were chosen by state politicians. And that system was famously corrupt. It was basically a millionaires' club controlled by corporate interests. This amendment gave the power to elect senators directly to the voters, making them accountable to the people for the very first time.
Then we get to the 18th Amendment, maybe the most famous and controversial progressive reform of them all, prohibition. This was the result of decades of activism from people who saw alcohol as the root cause of all sorts of social problems, from poverty to domestic violence. So they succeeded in banning the making and selling of alcohol across the entire country. It was a massive social experiment, and one with consequences that we're still talking about today.
And finally, the monumental 19th Amendment. This was the finish line of a struggle that lasted for generations. Women, suffragists, had fought tirelessly. They protested, they marched, they were arrested, all for their right to a voice in the democratic process. By giving women the right to vote, this amendment literally doubled the number of voters overnight and changed American politics forever. So, after all that, after the trust-busting, the cleaning of the cities, these huge constitutional amendments, what was the result? What did it all add up to? Let's take a look at the lasting legacy of this incredible era.
Well, the impact was just enormous. It was felt everywhere. The progressives totally changed the relationship between the government and big business. They transformed what it meant to live in an American city. They completely restructured the political system. But maybe more important than any single law was the big idea they left behind. The idea that government can and should be a tool for solving society's biggest problems.
And that brings us to the final big question. How successful were they really? I mean, there's no doubt the progressives reshaped America. The country was safer, it was healthier, and it was more democratic because of what they did. But did their reforms truly solve the nation's deepest problems? Did they put an end to inequality? Did they get rid of corruption for good? Well, those are the questions historians are still debating, and they're the questions I want to leave with you to think about.